Hello, and welcome to the RSCS World Built Environment Forum webinar series. My name is Kisa Zara, and today, over the next hour, we will be looking at air quality. Is it more than just about cutting carbon? We have three experts joining us today to discuss this very important issue. I would like to introduce Professor Enda Hayes. Hello, Enda.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me along.
Would you like to say a bit more about yourself?
Indeed. So my name is Enda Hayes. I'm a professor of air quality and carbon management based at the University of the West of England, which is in Bristol in the UK. And I lead a research group that work at the kind of interface or the nexus between air quality science, air quality policy, and how we work with and engage the public on this intractable challenge.
Thank you. We are also joined by Shamila Rajan. Shamila, would you like to give us more details about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm Shamila Rajan. I work with the American Lung Association as its National Director of Policy for Healthy Air. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I work specifically on the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And prior to joining the Lung Association, I worked as a research scientist as a structural biologist. I also, after moving on to the environmental field, I worked in regional air pollution control, but also in renewable energy. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, I would like to introduce Chris Rush. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, hi, thanks for having me along today. My name is Chris Rush. I lead up the air quality group at a building services company called Hawley, based in the UK and having various global coverage as well on that side of things. I'm a committee member for the Institute of Air Quality Management, which is the professional body for air quality in the UK. I've been involved in the publication of various guidance documents relating to the assessment of air quality, principally indoor air quality. And I'm also involved with the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers Air Quality Technical Working Group, helping with the interface between air quality professionals, building services engineers, and really trying to champion air quality throughout the design stages with a focus on health and well-being and how it interacts from a climate change perspective as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Today we have over 180 registrations from over 40 countries. Just a reminder to all attendees, do submit questions to our panel as it really helps to bring the conversation to life. If you are new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit questions at any time using the question box on your screen. We will pick up as many as we can as we go through the session. My first question is for Enda. So Enda, what pollutants are commonly found in air and what are the causes and how are we measuring these pollutant levels?
Okay, so when we think about traditional air pollution, the pollutants we're mostly interested in, particularly in our urban environments, are nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter. Now, nitrogen dioxide predominantly comes from road traffic, whereas particulate matter has a number of different sources, whether it's road traffic, industry, whether it's domestic solid fuel burning, so a number of different challenges. But again, depending on where you are around the world, there are other concerns that we have in terms of ground level ozone, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, etc. But in our urban environment, nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter are our primary concern. How are we measuring these? Well, there's a number of different ways of doing it. We've got reference methods, which are probably our best, shall we say, all singing, all dancing methods for measuring these pollutants. But they are quite expensive and quite costly to maintain and run. So if you kind of want to work back from those reference methods, we've also got passive methods like diffusion tubes that we can use for nitrogen dioxide. And what we're seeing in the air quality community is a growing number of low-cost sensors that can be used, particularly for kind of citizen science and engagement programs. There is a relationship then between air quality and carbon emissions, but that relationship is primarily around the commonality of sources. rather than any sort of atmospheric chemistry or interactions. So really, when you think about our carbon emissions, when you think about our traditional air pollutants, they're coming from the same sources, and consequently, the solutions we are looking for are going to be, where at all possible, are going to be co-beneficial in that they'll work to reduce both air quality and carbon emissions. And the ultimate challenge is to try and ensure that we avoid trade-offs in that we improve one pollutant, but as a consequence, make another one worse.
And what constitutes as good air quality?
So the WHO have thresholds for different pollutants, which are health-based thresholds that they have set out, and then each country works with those thresholds and have set themselves their own air quality objectives or air quality standards that they work towards. So, for example, with nitrogen dioxide, we have two objectives here in Europe and in the UK. We have an annual mean, which is 40 micrograms, and we have a 1 hour objective as well. And again, when we think about our urban environments and focusing on nitrogen dioxide for a moment, it's really that annual mean of 40 micrograms, which is primarily of concern in our urban areas across the UK and across Europe.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Shamala next. Shamala, how is poor air quality and pollution affecting our health?
So, hold on for a second. Sorry. So, air quality is determined by a whole range of pollutants, and there are conventional pollutants, and then you have now we have carbon emissions. So looking at carbon emissions, to be more specific, combustion-related carbon-containing greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide and methane, they are climate change drivers, which significantly impact human health in multiple ways. We consider climate change to be a health emergency. Now, these greenhouse gases influence climatic and planetary processes, such as increasing temperatures, increasing sea levels, which in turn cause intense and frequent heat waves and wildfires, droughts, dust and precipitation storms, which affect our respiratory and cardiovascular health. But additionally, carbon emissions also affect ambient or outdoor air quality by imposing a climate penalty on conventional pollution. That is, the changes they bring about in physical climatic components, which reduce air quality. For example, climate change is driving more frequent and extreme wildfires, which generate large amounts of particulate matter like black carbon or soot. And increased temperatures make ozone more likely to form, leading to more days with unhealthy ozone levels. So that's on the climate greenhouse components, carbon emissions. Now, coming back to conventional pollutants, I'll pick a couple of pollutants. One is, as Professor Hayes just mentioned, particulate matter. Now, particulate matter causes and or exacerbates a variety of respiratory, cardiovascular, developmental, neurological, and immunological illnesses. Examples include asthma attacks, lung cancer, increased risk of heart attacks, cognitive decline, preterm birth, low birth weight, and long-term exposure to particulate matter at very, very low levels can be deadly. So when it comes to inhaling particle pollutants, there's no level that's safe. So the other pollutant is ozone, which Professor Hayes mentioned, nitrogen dioxide. That's a precursor to ozone. Ozone is a powerful oxidant, just like a household bleach, and can kill living cells on contact. So when inhaled, ozone damages the tissues of respiratory tract, causing irritation and inflammation. It's pretty much like a sunburn of the lung. So exposure to high ozone levels, which are frequently seen during hot summer months, can worsen asthma, COPD, requires emergency treatment, causes chest tightness, increases allergic response, and there's a whole slew of symptoms, including metabolic disorders such as diabetes. So it affects a whole range. So you have, on one hand, you have conventional pollutants, which are which arise from combustible fuels, and then you have the same combustion giving rise to greenhouse gases, which also indirectly affect human health.
And Shamala, just to expand, which groups of people do you think are most at risk from air pollution?
Sure. So, well, all of us are impacted by air pollution to different degrees. The most vulnerable populations are children because their lungs are still developing, elderly because their lungs are not as robust, people with pre-existing medical conditions such as conditions such as respiratory illnesses, cardiovascular issues, and pregnant people. And then there's also the group of people who spend a lot of time outdoors, either because they have to work outdoors or they are recreating. They also are vulnerable.
And do you think there's a link between poor air quality and development in areas? So are sort of poorer areas and regions, do they suffer disproportionately from air quality?
The simple answer is yes. So industrial clusters, major highways, power plants are often located in economically deprived areas, leading to poor local air quality. Now, all of us use electricity, industrial goods and services, and highways. Most of us who can afford not to do not live near these sources of generation. In the US, we also have a history of redlining in which communities of color were systematically denied loans and investment. And other economic opportunities. So these historically redlined urban areas disproportionately impact people of color and economically deprived folks. And these are the areas that often have very poor air quality.
And can air pollutants find their way into sort of the food chain and affect our health in that way?
Absolutely, yes. So a classic example of an air pollutant finding its way into food systems is mercury. It's a persistent bioaccumulating toxic air pollutant, which finds its way into water bodies and into aquatic food chains. It accumulates in fish and other water-based animals, which are sources of food. Now, another example is more recent one is airborne microplastics, which have been found in human lung tissues and are now prevalent in both terrestrial and aquatic food systems.
Thank you, Shamala. I'm going to move on to Chris now. So Chris, how do pollution levels outdoors affect air quality indoors? And what sources of air pollution originate in homes and offices?
That's a nice small question. Thank you. Thanks for that. In short, and this question's quite good anyway in terms of highlighting the sort of the disconnect that is sometimes referred to as the air quality indoors and the air quality outdoors, and how separate these two environments are. And that's one point that it'd be good to expand on later on in terms of the division between how our regulatory system and how our the design process and how the assessments that we do in terms of designing good indoor air quality and great indoor air quality, how it's been restricted by this disconnect. So we're obviously trying to bridge the gap in terms of what we do as part of the design process. How outdoors affects indoors is they're massively impacted and influenced by each other. They're intrinsically linked depending on the type of development. Ultimately, depending on the location of the sources of pollution, roads most typically is the most dominant source of pollution, often in urban environments with road traffic being pretty prevalent, and the actual receptor, so a hotel, a office, a home, a school, by the very nature of they're often located very close to these pollution sources because people like good transport links to be able to get to these areas. As such, we've got the pollution source in very close proximity, and ultimately the only measure to actually help protect those users of that development, that building, that hospital, that home, that office, is distance, from the very basic principle of distance, to give some level of dispersion and dilution of the pollutants. But from a hard intervention of what can be provided at the actual building itself, the building facade, is the ventilation system. So depending on the type of building ventilation system that's in place, some buildings, older buildings, might have basic systems that are consisting of openable windows and that's it. They might have no level of treatment. You might, in that situation, you'll have pollutants coming directly in from the outdoors at the same concentration, and in some cases building up and accumulating in the indoor space. So these refuges that sometimes we think indoor spaces are from the outdoor environment aren't in fact as perfect as they could be with this ingress of pollutants from the outside. As individuals, we spend a lot of our time outdoors. We spend up to 90% indoors. Sorry, we spend up to 90% of our time indoors, and probably a lot of people on this webinar can empathize. I'm sure over the past 2 years, I know I personally have spent a lot more time than 90% of my time indoors working from home where I am right now, and particularly during pandemic times where I was forced to be at home all the time. There were some days where I was 100% indoors, and with the recent heat waves we've had here in the UK, it's meant that I've not been able to have my window open to ventilate. So effectively, I've been sealing myself in my environment, which has had a knock-on effect in terms of the buildup of pollutants in the indoor space. Indoor pollutants, so what actual sources of air pollution do we deal with inside our buildings, homes and offices? Similar to external, we've got particulate matter. Sources differ slightly in terms of resuspension of material as people walk over carpets, bring in external dust. Heating systems, when they come back into being, or ventilation systems when they kick in after say the summer period, or when they're increased during maybe heat waves in the summer, they can bring in a lot of dust if they aren't, or particulate matter if they're not serviced effectively, or they've been left standing still for a certain amount of time. They can result in a sort of a spike of PM in that indoor space. Homes, probably less so than offices, can also be impacted by basically cooking activities. So burning the toast is a nice obvious one. Having a gas stove as well, which many people still have, gas boilers, gas stoves, gas appliances, gas heating in the house. Wood burners as well, very fashionable to reinstate coal fire or wood burners in the home at the minute. That obviously increases the amount of particulates incredibly in the indoor space. Aside from polluting your neighbours, it can also mean you've massively impacted your own indoor air quality. So the refuge that indoor spaces perhaps are thought of sometimes from the outside world, I think when we're able to actually see what the pollutants are, aren't as good as we think they could be, really.
So how can we improve indoor air quality?
In terms of improving indoor air quality, I would say the sort of different levels. So from a high up design stage, regulatory, what can we do in terms of steering policy? It's making sure that we get interventions, understanding of design team, people who are able to influence throughout the design, architects, developers, clients, project managers, sustainability consultants, everyone on board in terms of what can be done to make sure we maximize it. It's similar to climate change and linked in there. There's no one action we can do that will solve it. There's no golden solution here that we can pull the trigger on this and it'll all be sorted. There's a number of interventions that have to be done to deliver good indoor air quality. As Shamla said a moment ago, there's no safe limit to be exposed to these pollutants. While there are limits for compliance, there's certainly benefits of moving beyond them. And as such, if we can inform design better, get better understanding, educate people in terms of the actual cost benefit of investing in indoor air quality, outdoor air quality mitigation measures, what can be done. It will cost, but the benefit will massively outweigh that financial cost. So in terms of ventilation systems, we can install, depending on the type of pollutants, better improved ventilation systems. And this is about also making sure that we install the right type of ventilation systems, not overburdening say buildings with very expensive, space consuming, financially expensive to upkeep, energy intensive bits of kit that have high carbon emissions as a result of it. We need to be conscious that if we are putting in an intervention to improve indoor air quality that might be very fine filtration to go beyond PM 2.5 perhaps, for ultra fines in some instances. What impact does that have on the overall energy and carbon emissions as a result of that? And we need to have that conversation and that understanding in terms of the tensions that can sometimes exist between striving towards reducing carbon emissions, climate change, and then delivering on the perhaps more shorter term benefits of improved health and well-being for air quality.
Thank you, Chris. Moving on to Enda, how well is air pollution being tackled in our towns and cities?
Another nice small question. We have to think about air pollution or air quality management from the perspective of diagnosing the problem to solving the problem. So I think in terms of the diagnosis of the problem, I think we've got exceptionally good at that. There's a lot of really good science out there in terms of how you measure. There's a lot of really good and new and innovative approaches in terms of how we model, how we understand the kind of the chemistry, the interactions, as we've already mentioned, the kind of health effects, exposure science, the impact on different populations, different communities. So I think we're getting quite good at understanding, finding, and diagnosing the problems, and we're quite effective at that. Where we're struggling and where we're failing is solving them. Now, there's a number of reasons why that might be happening. One of which, a lack of political will. Sadly, I think a lot of politicians work within political cycles, so they tend to deal with 4- and 5-year cycles between one election to another. The interventions we need to put in place to try and address air pollution are not easy interventions, and perhaps a lot of politicians shy away from that because they're not willing to take those steps. Another thing that slows us down is funding. Again, a lot of these interventions can be quite expensive. There's a nervousness, I think, as Chris mentioned, about the cost effectiveness of these interventions and also the cost benefit of those. So there's a nervousness towards that. There's also perhaps a little bit of an issue in terms of what I would describe as ownership of the solutions. When we think about air quality is often owned as a subject area, if you like, within our local authorities by environmental health. But actually the solutions sit with the transport department, sit with the planning department, and subsequently it's not necessarily a priority or a high priority for these other departments to try and solve. So there's a number of different reasons as to why at a city or a local authority level we're struggling to make that progress, if you like. However, there are some really good examples out there. For example, Paris has doing a lot of really great work in terms of encouraging active travel and getting more people out of their cars and onto bikes and walking and onto public transport. Here in the UK, we're seeing the introduction of clean air zones, so geographical areas where cars are restricted of, shall we say, certain types of cars and certain types of vehicles can be restricted in terms of whether they're allowed in and out of those areas. But a lot of these, and I mentioned it earlier, these issues around trade-offs, with a lot of these interventions, you have to be careful that you're not leaving anyone behind. And what I mean by that is that you're not implementing an intervention which the wealthier in society can adapt with and can work with, but the poorer of society might struggle with. The final thing I'd say about our ability to tackle these issues is air quality management, both here in the UK and indeed around the world, is not new. We've been working with this and doing it for 20, 30 years now. But I think what we've seen over those last 2 and 3 decades is an obsession with technocentric solutions. Now, what I mean by that is that when we think about air pollution, we tend to think about the where and the what. So the where being the hotspot, the geographical area where we've got an air pollution problem, and the what being the sources that are generating that problem, whether it's industry, road transport, domestic solid fuel burning, whether it's cars, buses, HGVs, taxis, whether it's different Euro standards, different fuel types. Now, because we tend to think about air pollution in that way, and indeed carbon emissions in that way, we tend to develop our policies that are very technocentric, in that they're focusing on solutions and innovation around the technology, and we're not doing enough to think about innovation around society. So instead, or as well as thinking about the where and the what, we also have to think about the who and the why. So who is generating the pollution and why are they doing it? So if I stick with transport as a case study, are we seeing a difference in terms of different demographics in the generation of pollution, male versus female, different ages, different income levels? Certainly here in the UK, we've done some research which, to summarize it quite simply, the richer you are, the more likely you are to create pollution, but the least likely you are to be exposed to it. And conversely, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be exposed to bad air quality, but the least likely you are to generate it. So we have to think about different demographics and how they might be generating pollution. And also have to then think about the motives. So sticking with the car, taking kids to school, leisure time, shopping, recreational time, all of the reasons and all of the behaviors and day-to-day practices and activities that actually result in people getting behind the wheel of the car and using private transport for moving around. So I think with air quality management, we've had a little bit too much of an obsession around the technical side of things and the need for technical innovation, but we need to marry that with societal innovation and understand that it's about people, it's about their behaviors, it's about their practices, and any interventions we look into to put into place has to be able to address both of those to ensure that they're successful.
And speaking of people and behavior, we have a question from Paula, and as one of our attendees, she's asking, how can plants and planting help, such as house plants or gardening work? Can that make a difference?
So certainly in the outdoor space, there has been plenty of research that's looked at the value that green infrastructure has in terms of A, taking certain pollutants out of the atmosphere, but B, more to do with how it can influence airflow. So it can actually create a green barrier between the source of air pollution, so shall we say traffic on a road, and where sensitive receptors may exist. So I know there's a lot of good research looking at schools, for example, and could you put green infrastructure between transport and between kind of school playgrounds and school buildings and things like that. So certainly in the outdoor space, green infrastructure can have a positive impact. In the indoor space, I might defer to Chris there, as he's more of an indoor person than I am. But certainly, I think anywhere where you use and engage with green infrastructure and the greening of the environment, it's going to have a positive impact, not just on air pollution, but also on things like urban cooling and the kind of the aesthetic of the urban environment and how it becomes more attractive for people.
Chris, would you like to come in on that question?
Yeah, happy to add to that. That was perfectly summed up. From an indoor, just to jump on the indoor perspective element side, totally agree. Any kind of provision of green in an indoor space is of benefit in terms of well-being of individuals on a very sort of often non-tangible basis. As much as we'd love to be able to test it and prove it, that there is statistics available, but there's that whole well-being argument around it. In terms of the health element and health side, while there are various studies, I think that the ones that I have seen tend to focus on certain plant species under certain lab conditions. Very high lux levels can provide some kind of quantitative scrubbing ability, but this is exceptionally high light levels in certain conditions, and I think the plant density to actually have anything that could be influence monitoring, particularly using non-reference grade bits of kit that we might see in some offices, isn't really feasible. But the overall benefit in terms of just well-being is not to be argued, for sure.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Shamala now. So Shamala, how is research on air quality helping to drive change among policymakers, do you think?
Right. I'll speak from the perspective of the Lung Association where I work. So we produce several research and analysis reports on air quality issues related to human health. Now, these reports are resources not only for the general public and health and air quality advocates, but also for lawmakers at the national, state, and local levels. So with all these reports, we do a major release. We do major release events on all kinds of media, print, TV, radio, social media, to maximize coverage and get local exposure. We ensure continuing news coverage with interviews and webinars. So we essentially promote them on all advocacy platforms. We share them with local, state, and federal legislators in the Congress, with policymakers at the federal agencies. We also share them with our advocacy partners. We basically try to get everyone to talk about it and cite it. So, and our local advocates also drive petitions to their local congresswomen and men to take actions to improve air quality. I can give you a couple of examples. So the Lung Association produces, as I said, several reports, some on an ad hoc basis and others that are released annually. All these reports are interactive, available, published on the website, with data broken down by state. I'll give you an example of each. In the former category is the newly released report. It's called Zeroing In on Healthy Air, which provides a national assessment of health and climate benefits of transitioning to zero emission transportation and electricity generation, because transportation and power generation are the two biggest sectors of both conventional pollutants and greenhouse gases. So the report models the health benefits, including value in dollars of nationwide adoption of policies to switch to zero emission vehicles and zero emission electricity generation. That's an ad hoc report. Now, for the annual reports, the Lung Association signature report is called the annual State of the Air report, which grades local areas in every state by their air quality. Now, the air quality consists of monitored particulate matter and ozone levels averaged over the past 3 years. Here also, we have recommendations for the general public and also for policymakers. Using these documents, we have argued for stronger national ambient air quality standards for particulate matter and ozone. And the US Environmental Protection Agency is due to release its proposed rulemaking on particulate matter, hopefully this month. And the science underlying the ozone standard is currently under review by the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. So we'll know soon whether the success of our advocacy at the national level. But we've already been successful with these reports in getting some policy changes in air quality at the local and state level.
Can you share some examples of any specific projects or work that's been undertaken that's used some of the insights from these studies?
Right. So the zeroing in on healthy air, the one that I mentioned, that has been that we've done outreach to people in Congress at the national level and also at the state level. And it's interesting to note part of our advocate, I cannot claim to be the, our organization to be the only one. We've had several organizations push for this. And so one of the success stories is both California and so states on the Pacific Coast, California and Washington are planning to, I think by 2035, phase out all, actually not sell any gasoline powered, petroleum powered vehicles in those states. So that's a positive sign. That is part of what we are arguing for, is zero emission transportation. And we've also been very active in promoting renewable energy power generation. And we've used the annual State of the Air report to argue for stronger outdoor air quality standards. So right now, the Environmental Protection Agency, which sets the standards for national standards for criteria pollutants, which Professor Hayes mentioned earlier, NO2, oxides of sulfur, oxygen, sulfur and nitrogen, and then for ozone and particulate matter. So the Environmental Protection Agency is currently reviewing the standards for particulate matter and ozone. So hopefully we'll get stronger standards, especially because we have the climate penalty being imposed on these conventional pollutants. And because combustion is the source of combustion of fuel, whether it's fossil fuel or even biomass, combustion is the source for all these criteria pollutants, as well as conventional criteria pollutants, as well as greenhouse gases. So we are our main goal is to move us as a society across all sectors, economy-wide, move us away from fuel burning, combustible, energy sources.
Thank you. Thank you. Moving on to industry. So, Chris, how is the construction industry addressing air pollution?
So I can obviously, like everything, I'll speak from my perspective and a UK focus on that, really, in terms of the construction industry. I suppose focusing on policy level and what's driving things currently and embedded in the past few years and probably firmly embedded with a number of projects that I'm working on and schemes and developments that are working their way through the planning system and actually being built out now, is obviously electric vehicles. That's a big push in terms of reducing emissions, lowering emissions. We've got a drive in the UK in general about moving away from diesel and petrol combustion engines in our vehicles, or at least cars, maybe not HGVs, in the not too distant future. As part of that, all developments that we're working on are either looking towards particularly urban central type developments, looking to be car free as best as car free can be, or having some EV provision in terms of following that policy. Energy emissions that were associated with previous construction jobs in terms of energy combustion plant that may have been included. That means CHPs, boilers, gas-fired boilers and the like. We're seeing a shift towards air source heat pumps and zero emission technology there. So again, emissions that are historically part of developments in terms of the external air quality that would have impacted that side are being steadily moved away from. In terms of the indoor space, we've got a focus heavily on dust. The construction industry has always had an issue with dust emissions as part of its activities when building out developments, and as such, the dust, the particulate matter, is a strong focus on that side. The furnishings and fittings as well inside the indoor space, from the construction perspective. So what is used in terms of paints, what is being used in terms of glues, carpets, furniture, desks. So how are the buildings, homes, hospitals, offices that are being constructed, once they are there, once they are present, what are they being fitted with? How the construction industry is actually tackling that is currently, and it's probably not going to come as a surprise, is heavily compliance led by that stage, and this is one of the areas that really does need improvement in terms of air quality, health and well-being, is just a drive towards better regulation, better understanding of the issues around just complying with or just using a low VOC paint. There's still issues around it. Can there be better provision there, really? So the construction industry, I think, is being driven and will be driven, particularly in the interim before any level of legislation is brought to bear or improved or tightened, by growing awareness. So people are going to be, and are already, and we have seen it, that people are growing in their awareness of air quality, the impacts that it can have on them, and the impacts that poor air quality in the indoor space can particularly have on them, their family, their loved ones. The pandemic, particularly here in the UK, one of the big focuses was about ventilation, which it was worldwide, obviously. So again, all of a sudden, people are and this might sound odd, but people are realizing that they actually breathe, that they take in the air as one of their consumables. So alongside choosing a healthy meal to eat, choosing fresh water to drink, they're actually realizing, actually, I should be demanding improved air quality here, and they're demanding that from their workspaces now. We're having our the offices that we are involved with in terms of working on. We're having the developers actually wanting to embed indoor air quality sensors there and promoting that and integrating it with the individuals working in that space, so that they can see that the office they're coming to, being drawn back to as we move out and away from home working, that it is a healthy space and that it is a safe, in inverted commas, space as well. So people are actually demanding this change. This is massively supported by, possibly in the past 10, definitely the past 5 years, by a proliferation of more affordable and certainly non-reference grade monitoring equipment in the marketplace. So we've got kits produced by companies like Dyson, air purifiers, but also just pure air quality monitoring kits that you can buy off Amazon. A lot of air quality monitoring kits you can buy off Amazon now that are plug and play type devices that can be used in a domestic setting, that are effectively making the invisible visible. And people are now seeing their air quality, as it were, in their homes. They're seeing it on signs during their commute. I'm based in Greater Manchester, and we have, and I know they have in a number of cities in the UK, on some big advertising boards saying, you're breathing in this, know your air quality. They have it on tube and bus station signs here in the UK. Sometimes an air quality alert might be on the weather, saying it's a high pollution day. People are starting to listen to this. There's growing awareness, and I think they're demanding that as part of the buildings they're living in, working in, playing in, and that's trickling back through. So the missing link to all this is compliance monitoring. That's what we've not had in the AQ industry to date. And Part F, which is a building regulation in the UK here, has brought in a need to monitor CO2 at least in our indoor spaces as part of that. So this monitoring that will be brought in as part of some legal requirements in some settings, coupled with this better and improved knowledge and demand and awareness of air quality, in parallel with the provision of more affordable kits now that allow people to actually interact and see the invisible, all adds together to meaning that people can't get away with the bury the head in the sand approach. The ignorance is bliss. So I can't see it, hear it, smell it, so it must be fine. Well, what is your air quality? Do you know it? And that's going to have a knock-on effect to go right back to the start of any kind of design process, so that when people are sat in the office, if they see it's bad air quality, they'll be asking their constructors, the people who have constructed the building, why is it bad? What have you done during the construction phase? What have you done in the design stage? So I think it will force the issue from that perspective. So there needs to be improvement. There has been some, but there needs to be a lot more.
Do you think that there is enough understanding within the industry about the causes of air pollution, carbon and other than carbon?
I think there's pockets of understanding, and I think in terms of carbon, I think there's a focus which is absolutely key in terms of climate change, and that's where carbon sits. It's an issue around climate change, and it's something that we need to be certainly aware of, particularly when we're talking about air quality, because there's sometimes this tension between creating an environment for good air quality, great air quality hopefully, and considering climate. An example is, if we want to improve the air quality in a space, say a sealed meeting room in an office, we might say, well, it needs higher levels of ventilation. That comes with an energy cost, comes with a carbon footprint associated with that. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. In terms of the awareness, absolutely, that's key to it. Awareness of individuals in terms of what's happening in their environment. People don't have to be an expert in it, but they need to be aware that they have a role to play as part of it, and that's a role from every discipline: architects, project managers, sustainability consultants, operators of buildings, owners and operators, people who come into the office workers, hospital workers. It's not to say everyone has to be an air quality consultant, but understanding that it's your air quality, and maybe they should be engaged with it. I know my watch that I wear, which is a smartwatch, actually has an air quality index on there, but I'm not too sure many people would understand what that air quality index means. But having an understanding of it, engaging with it, being empowered to take some kind of action on it as well, not just saying, oh, well, the monitor's flashing red. Okay, well, we'll leave it. Well, what does red mean? And if it's red, what do I need to do to make it hopefully amber or green? So absolutely knowledge, awareness, and it doesn't just fall down to creating a sparkling, fantastic building that's really well designed and everyone can really sort of shake hands at the end of it and go, haven't we done well? It doesn't end there. People who use it need to be aware, educated, understanding, taking ownership, and that goes through the life of the scheme as well. You need ongoing monitoring, you need ongoing feedback as the use changes, as more people are pushed into that space. We need continuous monitoring because air quality isn't static. It goes up and down during the day, during the week, during the year, during the seasons. So we need to understand that, and people need to be empowered for that, really.
Mm-hmm. We've had another question on what are sort of things that employers can do for their staff, specifically staff who basically work outdoors. Is there something that employers can do?
For staff that work outdoors in terms of improving their air quality, I suppose it, just to be difficult, it does depend on where they're. So I suppose if they're at a roadside, working on a busy road, you know, or a construction site, with any kind of pollution, it's always, not always, but it's usually easiest to deal with it at source. So for an example, if you're a construction worker and you're on a site, you're probably the key pollution you're exposed to is probably particulate matter, lots of dust from soil handling, materials being moved around, maybe NOx, NO2 from vehicles passing by. But can, say, vehicles be electrified on site? Can generators not be put right next to a site cabin where people might be sat down to have their lunch? So again, increasing the distance between source and receiver, as in the people who are going to be exposed to it and the actual pollution, removing that pollution source. Can they be electric generators? Do they need to be diesel powered generators that are on site? If it is dusty on site, why is it dusty? Can we not have it so that when it is dusty, you've got dust suppression mechanisms in place to make sure dust is kept down, that type of thing. In terms of an office environment, a good example, I mean, for myself, when I do go into the office, we still have our cleaners come in during the morning and do a great job cleaning all the surfaces in the office with some nice chemicals, nice smelling chemicals, and they wipe down the desk, and I'm usually there reasonably early, and they'll be I have to lean back while they just quickly wipe around the desk, leaving a nice wet chemical smelling desk and environment for everyone to sit in, really. So some soft measures could be there. Does the cleaning need to happen when people are going to be in the office? Or can we actually say, could we have that cleaning done after hours, out of hours, to avoid that clash of, again, pollution spikes happening when the people are there? So it's not always a matter of we'll have to completely redesign the building, we're going to have to invest in massive amounts of equipment. It can be as simple as looking at the cleaning regime. Can we use different types of chemicals? Do we need to be doing it at the same time? So yeah, innovative approaches, really. So it can be quite simple soft measures right through to big design changes, really.
Thank you. And this is a question for all of our panelists. What are some of the key recommendations do you have to improve air quality and reduce air pollution? I can start with Enda.
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Okay. So I've been working in the air quality field for too long, two decades now. And one of the frustrations I've had is, to some extent, air quality management has become a little bit of a box ticking exercise. And dare I say it, to manage air quality, we need to stop talking about air quality. And what I mean by that is, 40 micrograms is bad, but 39.9 micrograms is good. It's just become a little bit of a numbers game. So what I'd like to see is more focus, again, back on people and back on health and back on different populations, more focus on understanding exposure science, understanding the impact of deprivation, more focus on what I mentioned earlier, societal innovation, and understanding that people are not some sort of, and I'm going to show that I'm a little bit of a Star Wars or Star Trek fan here, they're not some sort of Borg entity that all act the same, move the same, interact with their environment the same. So I'd like to see more focus back on realizing that air quality is actually about health risk and health management. and bringing more of that science and that knowledge into how local authorities and cities actually manage their environment. Second thing I'd pick up on is what Chris mentioned is awareness raising. And again, recognizing that the way you talk to the mayor of a city would be very different from the way you would talk to a retired couple, would be very different from the way you would talk to young people in a school. So I think there's a huge amount we can learn from the science communication and public engagement communities in terms of how we get the story out there about the what we say, the generation of air pollution, the impacts of air pollution, and how we give people a sense of ownership not only of the problem, but also ownership of the solutions and the role that they can have. And then the final one for me is, I suppose, being a little bit more proactive rather than reactive in terms of getting the science into the policy sphere. You know, we know microplastics are an issue. I feel like we're going to have to spend quite a long time gathering science and gathering evidence around microplastics before they truly become something that's being considered within the policy sphere. We haven't mentioned things like ammonia and the impact on sensitive habitats. We've really focused on public health here, but that's certainly an issue. And I think Chris raised it at earlier on when he talked about solid fuel burning in the homes. It's what we describe as aesthetic pollution. You know, this idea, you don't necessarily need the heat. I'm thinking about certainly in Western cultures, you know, the central heating is working away really good in the corner, yet we still have a solid fire burning because it looks nice, because it reminds us of our grandparents' home when we grew up. So certainly, I think we need to address these kind of emerging issues, like what we describe as aesthetic pollution, microplastics, ammonia, etc. And I'd like to see us using the science quicker and getting ahead of that before it becomes a problem that we then have to try and retrospectively fix.
Thank you. Shamala, do you have any key recommendations?
Sure. So to improve outdoor air quality and protect human health, we need an economy-wide transition to zero emissions. Easier said than done. Now, this will involve both supply side management and demand side management. So on the supply side, you know, transportation and energy production are the two biggest sources of carbon emissions and conventional pollutants, because primarily they use fossil fuels and also other combustible energy sources like biomass. So anything that burns produces pollutants. So at the Lung Association, we advocate for transition to combustion-free, zero emissions, clean energy production. We recommend electricity generation through non-combustible renewable sources and switching transportation, industrial, commercial, and residential sectors to run on electricity. So that's again, you know, it's on the policy side to change the supply side management. And as Professor Hayes said, you know, science-based policy is hard to come by these days. Now, on the demand side, each of us can do something. Somebody, you mentioned one of the questions that one of the listeners asked about you know, gardening and growing plants. Now, one of the things, the way I look at it, it's not so. Greenery, for instance, you know, any plant that produces chlorophyll, that's the only natural carbon sequestration that we have, which is plants. And so growing them, it's not only just it's a pastime or a hobby. It has mental health benefits, and the other thing is it keeps you fit. And the other thing is the underlying important point is the more you are healthier mentally and physically, the less dependent you are on any kind of medication. So, and every medicine, as you know, has a huge energy footprint. So it has, you know, small things like that are on the demand side management, where you spend more time, you know, with things like gardening and such. And the more practical things that you could do is, you know, take public transportation, walk, bike, Be mindful of how much energy you use, so energy efficiency, and keeping an eye on your energy consumption. So these are all the things we can do. Each of us can do something to reduce our footprint every day. So that's on the demand side. So it requires both policy and personal policy changes and personal responsibility in getting to clean air and healthier environment.
Chris, do you have anything to add?
It's hard to follow, so I'll probably try and rehash and echo exactly what the guys have just said. Really, excellent points. I'll keep it fairly brief. From my perspective, yep, absolutely no safe limit to be exposed to these pollutants. So we should be looking to actually stop talking about air quality and compliance. And if you've met that level, then it's all fine. That's such a common issue that we're dealing with, and in terms of actually trying to say yes, but there's a benefit of moving beyond it. And I totally agree with Enda about the use of air quality. The term air quality has been used so much, and we should be focusing more on the term clean, in my mind anyway, clean air. What can we do to deliver clean air, a truly clean air environment? And for that, it's not just one that's legally compliant, it moves beyond compliance and ideally delivers some level of air quality positive. So actually improves the air quality for people, not just ticking a box at a certain level, and allows and permits a level to pollute to effectively, which is what we currently work to, unfortunately. Secondly, design stages of a development. Ultimately, like it or not, we need to work through these as part of a process in terms of from a green site, from a green field, right through to actually having the building up and running. We need to work through these stages, and at the minute, air quality is not embedded throughout that process. Other disciplines like acoustics, fire engineering, sustainability, mechanical engineering have some presence throughout that design process, which means lessons learned at the early stage during site feasibility are drawn right through the process to actual operation. Unfortunately, air quality drops off the table midway through, and that's one of the issues in reality why, at least in the UK, why we've seen a lack of air quality being brought through, and it tends to be an afterthought or not thought of at all, or thought of that it's all sorted. So having an improvement there in terms of how air quality is brought to the table, as it were. And my last point is really a bit of a cheesy one, is making the invisible visible. So it's not like acoustics or noise, where if we stay in a hotel and the building's not been designed properly and there's a noisy motorway outside, we'll have a terrible night's sleep and then we'll complain about it, and it'll mean something's done at some point. If we're in a hotel and there's a busy motorway outside and we get exposed to the pollution, we're not going to really spot it. And we need monitoring technology to show us what's there in the air, to be blunt. Thankfully, it's becoming more affordable now, but I'd say we need monitoring throughout all of our spaces, external and internal. We need that to be continuous, not just a snapshot in time 5 years ago. We need it to be continuously being reported. And as part of that, like everyone's touched on, it's great to collect data, but we need it to be used, understood, interpreted in the right way. So having that expertise there to make sure it's communicated to the right stakeholders, which is not a term I like, but the right individuals, whether it's that mayor or the older couple, the older residents who may be there living in one area, it needs to be communicated properly. So it's all a collaborative effort, and we need everyone to come together. It's not just down to us in this room as air quality professionals, or us on this panel as air quality professionals to deliver the solution. It takes all bodies really to come together to help solve.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our panelists and our attendees. A reminder that we will publish a recording and written summary of this webinar, as well as this presentation online, and do feel free to share this with your professional networks. Please also take a few minutes to let us know what you thought about today's session by completing the online poll, which will appear on your screens at the end of the webinar. Please do join us for another webinar in the future. You can see the website for further details. You can also watch any previous webinars that you may have missed. Next week, we have a very interesting webinar on the 14th of September about the 2022 Sustainability Report, looking at key sustainability issues in the built environment sector and discussing whether there's been any progress across the industry in this area over the last 12 months. You can also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, where you can receive news and upcoming webinars, as well as recently published articles. Finally, you can download the WebEF app from the App Store or Google Play, where you can access the latest innovative global thought leadership content across the built environment. Until next time, goodbye.